For more than 20 years, one country has been building its way around a stretch of water. Pipelines through mountains, storage caverns, ports on a foreign coastline, tens of billions of dollars across 4 countries on 3 separate solutions. And today, most of its imported oil still arrives through the same shipping lane it always did. At the narrowest point, the usable channel is under 3 kilometers wide. So, was 20 years of construction a failure? No. And working out why not is the most interesting thing about this entire subject. Because everything that got built was answering a different question from the one everybody assumes it was answering. This is File 2, the Strait of Malacca. This is the Rise Index. This season asks one question 8 ways. Where does economic power actually sit once you stop looking at countries and start looking at the narrow places? File 1 was the Suez Canal, and it ended on a distinction that sets up this one. A canal is a choke point human beings dug. They dug it in the 19th century and widened part of it in 2015, which means its capacity is, in the end, a question of money and time. Malacca is the other kind. Nobody dug it, nobody can widen it. It is roughly 800 kilometers of water between the Malay Peninsula and the Indonesian island of Sumatra, and it is where the Indian Ocean meets the South China Sea. 3 numbers frame the episode. First, that width. Under 3 kilometers of usable channel at the tightest point near Singapore, and the word usable is doing real work there. The shoreline is further apart than that. The water deep enough and organized enough for a loaded tanker is not. Second, the volume. American government figures put 23 million barrels of oil a day through this strait. That is 29% of all the oil moved by sea anywhere on Earth, which makes it the largest choke point on the planet by that measure. Bigger than Hormuz. Roughly 5 times the Suez Canal. And of the imports crossing it, close to half are going to one country. China. That is a measured share, not an estimate, and it is the reason this file is about one country's 20-year construction project. Third, 20 years. That is roughly how long the phrase Malacca dilemma has been circulating in Chinese policy discussion, which means this vulnerability was named publicly by the people it applies to before most of the infrastructure in this episode existed. So this is not an episode about a country that has not noticed a problem. It is an episode about what 20 years of noticing actually produced. And it comes down to one piece of addition that we're going to do out loud near the end, and that almost nobody covering this subject bothers to do. One warning before we start, because it is going to matter twice. Almost every number attached to this topic is an estimate rather than a measurement, and several of them are widely quoted with the wrong scope attached. We will say which is which as we go. And the largest single number in the entire inventory turns out to be a figure from a brochure rather than a figure from a meter. The obvious answer is that Malacca is dangerous because it is narrow. Narrow means a few ships in the wrong place, or bad weather, or an accident, and a very large share of one country's fuel supply is interrupted. That framing is everywhere, and it is not wrong so much as it is aimed at the wrong feature. Let us test it properly using the tool from File 1. Last file gave this season its vocabulary, the toll and the detour. Every choke point has a price for using it and a price for going around it, and its power is the distance between those 2 numbers. Suez had a published tariff and a 14-day detour around Africa, and when the effective cost of the route rose, traffic went the long way and the canal lost half its business without closing for a day. Now run the same test on Malacca, and it fails immediately, in 2 directions. Start with the toll. There isn't one. Nobody charges for passage through the Strait of Malacca. It is not a canal. It is not owned. There is no authority issuing an invoice for going through it. Which turns out to matter enormously. Suez had an owner, and an owner has revenue. And revenue means something to lose and something to negotiate over. Malacca has none of that. There is nobody collecting, so there is nobody to pay, and no commercial lever of any kind. A choke point that sends no bill is a choke point you cannot buy your way through. Now the detour, and this is where it gets genuinely surprising. Malacca has alternatives, two of them, the Sunda Strait and the Lombok Strait, both running through Indonesian waters. And they are not a 14-day problem. Going via Lombok instead of Malacca adds days, not weeks. Compared with sailing around Africa, that is almost nothing. Which raises an obvious question. If there are two alternative straits and the extra distance is measured in days, why has anybody spent 20 years and tens of billions of dollars on this? The answer is that everyone has been describing the choke point slightly wrong, including, for a while, us. Two reasons. The alternatives do not solve it, and the second one is the whole episode. First, capacity. Sunda and Lombok are narrower in useful terms and less suited to the largest loaded tankers. They absorb some traffic. They cannot absorb all of Malacca's traffic, which runs to tens of thousands of transits a year. Having a detour is not the same as having a detour wide enough. Second, and this is the part that reframes everything. Look at where all three straits are. Malacca runs between Malaysia and Sumatra. Sunda runs between Sumatra and Java. Lombok runs between Bali and Lombok. Every single alternative to the Strait of Malacca is another gap in the same archipelago. So the choke point was never the strait. The choke point is Southeast Asia. Switching from one channel to another does not reduce the dependency by any amount at all, because the dependency was never on 3 kilometers of water. It was on a region, and a region is not something you sail around. And that is the difference between this episode and the last one that everything else follows from. Suez had a detour. It was expensive and slow and it hurt, but it existed, and shipping lines took it for a year. Malacca does not have a detour at the scale required. Not a longer one, not a costlier one. There is no version of that route that avoids the region, which is why the response could not be rerouting. If you cannot go around it, the only remaining options are to go under it, over it, beside it, or to need less of what goes through it. So that is what got built. And it is worth naming the category properly, because the category explains the design. What you build against an immovable choke point is not a route, it is a portfolio. A portfolio does not solve the problem. It spreads it, shaves it, and delays it. Every item in what follows does one of those three things, and not one of them does what a detour does. That distinction is not pedantry, and it is the reason this episode disagrees with almost everything written about the subject. A route question has an answer that either works or does not. A portfolio question has an answer that is a quantity. How much, for how long, at what cost? Those get judged completely differently, and the entire 20-year program has been judged against the wrong one. And there is one item in the inventory that looks like the biggest solution of the lot, and is, on close inspection, doing something much stranger than advertised. Hold that one, it is coming up first. The inventory. 4 categories, and they are worth taking in order of how much they are talked about, which is almost exactly the reverse of how much they do. 1. Pipelines that reach the sea earlier. There is a crude oil pipeline and a gas pipeline running from Chokepoint on the coast of Myanmar across the mountains into Yunnan province. They have been operating since the mid-2010s, and the crude line's design capacity is usually put at around 400,000 barrels a day. Some sources say a little more, some a little less, depending on whether they are quoting the operator or the annual tonnage. Hold the rough size rather than the decimal, because what matters next is not the precision, it is the comparison. And here is the strange part. That oil still arrives at Chokepoint by ship. It crosses the Indian Ocean on a tanker, exactly as it always did. The pipeline does not remove the sea voyage. It removes the last leg of it, the part through the strait, and it does so by making a landfall about 2,000 kilometers earlier than it otherwise would. That is not a criticism. It is a precise description of what the asset does, and most accounts get it wrong in the flattering direction. It shortens exposure. It does not eliminate it, and it substitutes one dependency, a strait, for another, a pipeline through a neighboring country's territory, which brings its own constraints. It is worth pausing on what that pipeline is, physically, because the abstraction hides the achievement. It runs from a coastal terminal in Rakhine State, across the Arakan Mountains, through territory where the construction crews were building at altitude, and through monsoon and into Yunnan. Somebody surveyed that route. Somebody welded that pipe. It is one of the harder pieces of civil engineering attempted this century, and the reason it exists is a sentence in a policy paper about a strait 2,000 kilometers away. And hold on to that, because when we do the addition at the end, this pipeline is going to look much smaller than the effort that produced it, which is the honest shape of this entire subject. 2. Pipelines that never touch water. Oil and gas lines from Kazakhstan, gas from Turkmenistan across Central Asia, and oil and gas from Russia. These are the real thing. Land the whole way, no strait, no tanker, no Indian Ocean. And they carry a trade-off that is rarely stated. A tanker can load anywhere on Earth. If a supplier becomes expensive or unavailable, you buy from a different one and the ship simply goes to a different port. A pipeline cannot be repointed. It connects you to specific neighbors permanently through fixed steel. So pipelines convert a geographic risk into a counterparty risk. That is a real improvement if you think the geography is the bigger danger. It is not a solution, and describing it as one hides the trade that was actually made. 3. Time. China has built strategic petroleum reserves in phases since the mid-2000s. The size is not fully or regularly published, and every figure you will see quoted is an outside estimate, typically working out to some weeks of imports. Reserves do nothing whatsoever about geography. A cavern of oil does not move a strait. What it buys is the ability to be indifferent to a short interruption, which converts an acute problem into a scheduling one, provided the interruption is short. 4. Ports. Chinese firms have invested in port infrastructure across the Indian Ocean rim, including Chokepoint in Myanmar, Gwadar in Pakistan, and Hambantota in Sri Lanka. These are commercial port projects and commercial agreements, and this episode treats them as exactly that. What they do economically is shorten and diversify the sea legs. They do not remove them. Now add it up, which is the part nobody does. Take the design capacity of every oil pipeline that avoids the strait, Myanmar, Kazakhstan, the Russian lines. Set that total against total daily crude imports. The pipelines handle a minority of the total, a meaningful minority. Not a majority and not close to one. And that comparison is being generous because design capacity is the number on the brochure. Actual throughput on these lines has often run below it, sometimes well below. So after 20 years, tens of billions of dollars, 4 countries and 3 categories of solution, the honest summary is that most of the crude still comes by sea through the same region and a large share of it through the same strait. Which sounds like a verdict of failure, and it is not one. It is the wrong scorecard, and the right one changes the answer completely. because none of this was ever an attempt to replace the strait. That was never available. You cannot replace geography, and the people who built these things knew that before the first survey was completed. Naming the dilemma in 2003 was, among other things, an admission that the direct solution does not exist. What a portfolio does is change the shape of a disruption. Without it, an interruption is immediate and total. With it, some flow continues on land, some volume sits in storage, and the country holds a number of weeks in which to do something else. It converts a cliff into a slope. Same shape as the bill in last season, which is worth naming because it recurs. Every arrangement that works has one. Here the bill is paid in capital, sunk into assets that are deliberately less efficient than the sea route they hedge against, and in the fact that pipelines tie you to a small number of neighbors rather than to a global market. Which is the Season 1 capability axis, exactly. We put it this way in the finale. You can own the factory and not own the door it sells through. 20 years of construction here is one enormous attempt to own a few more doors, and it is instructive that even at this scale and with this much money, most of the traffic still uses somebody else's. And there is a fifth item in the inventory that we have not mentioned yet, which is the only one that can actually win. Every solution so far tries to find a different path to the same oil. Pipelines, ports, storage, same barrels, different route, or same barrels held earlier. There is one measure that does not do that. It reduces the barrels. Domestic production exists, but the large fields are old, and it does not close the gap. Coal to chemicals lets some products be made from domestic coal instead of imported crude, and that is real, though modest against total demand. And then there is road transport, which is electrifying and which is where most of a country's oil demand actually sits. So, the only measure in this entire episode that structurally solves a geography problem has nothing to do with geography. It has no map, no ribbon cutting, and no photograph of a pipeline crossing a mountain. It is a slow change in what vehicles run on, and if it continues, it does something no pipeline can do. It makes the strait matter less every year, without anyone building anything near it. 3 figures for the verdict. Under 3 kilometers of usable channel. 23 million barrels of oil a day, 29% of everything moved by sea, the largest choke point on Earth. And a minority of one country's share of that, covered by every land pipeline combined at design capacity. Which answers the question this episode opened with. 20 years of building did not fail. It was never trying to replace the strait, because the strait cannot be replaced. It was buying weeks, shaving a share, and spreading the risk across more counterparties. That is what a portfolio is for, and judged as a portfolio, it has done reasonably well. Now, the strongest argument against everything just said, because it deserves a fair hearing and it might be right. It goes like this. The strait does not need replacing, and the portfolio is close to unnecessary, because the traffic through Malacca is not one country's. It carries fuel and goods for Japan, for South Korea, for much of Southeast Asia, and for shipping lines from everywhere. Interrupting it would damage a very long list of economies simultaneously, including several with no quarrel in the matter at all. Which is a genuine mechanism, and it has a name worth keeping. A choke point that too many parties depend on is defended by the dependency itself. That argument is strong, and this episode does not defeat it. The only thing to add is that it is an argument about incentives, and every other item in this episode is an argument about capacity. Countries that can afford to hedge both usually do. 2 files in, and the pattern is already visible. Suez is a choke point with an owner, a tariff, and a detour, and it can lose everything without closing. Malacca has no owner, no tariff, and no detour at scale, and the only response available is to build a portfolio and wait. Both are made of water, and both, for all the money involved, are things you can point at on a map and photograph from a helicopter. So what happens to all of this when the Chokepoint has no water in it, no owner in any ordinary sense, and no location you could visit? Because something like 99% of the world's international data traffic does not travel by satellite. It runs through cables on the seabed, most of them about the thickness of a garden hose, and they are laid, owned, and repaired by private companies. When one breaks in international waters, the question of whose law applies is genuinely unsettled. Next file, we find out what that costs. This is the Rise Index. Subscribe and follow where power moves next.